So I grabbed the video camera, filmed the engine burning, came back in to the cockpit, focused on the altimeter, which happened to be flight level 350 or 35,000 feet, because the boss, while he was firing people, would say, nothing burns at 35,000 feet. I grew up around little airplanes. My father and mother flew. My father was a home builder and restored antique airplanes, and my mother was a flight instructor. And when I started my career, the first 5 years were as a crop duster, which I loved, very gratifying at the end of the day, a lot of gratification in that job. And I thought I'd diversify a little bit, maybe learn to fly in weather and multi-engine airplanes. So I ended up flying Beech 18s, which kind of started this whole conversation. And I went to work for a single pilot as opposed to a crewed airplane freight company in the Detroit area that flew just-in-time parts for the automotive assembly industry. And at the time, the training was standard 1970s charter flying training, which basically consisted of good luck, kid, and they turned you loose. And I certainly had a commercial license to do the crop dusting, but I needed an added rating called an instrument rating in order to fly in weather. So the ink was still wet on my temporary instrument certificate when I got this job flying Twin Beeches, so not terribly knowledgeable. The only reason I'm still here is because the Twin Beech is such a stable instrument platform, and it can carry a terrific load of ice. Airframe icing is an issue in the Northeast and northern states in the wintertime. And I went to work for the company. I very quickly checked out and was flying, and if I had time off on the weekend, I'd go to the airport cafe and get a cup of coffee because there were several Twin Beech outfits on the field, and Saturday was training day. Well, I didn't have any trouble with the airplane because I knew about tail wheels and radial engines from the crop dusting end of it. But that couldn't be said for everyone. So the training in the takeoffs and landings was kind of fun to watch. And so I'd see tires screeching and airplanes swerving on the runway, and I'd be just chuckling and enjoying my coffee at the time. For about 3 weeks, when they turned to me and said, "Waldo, you seem to have this airplane figured out. You're an instructor." So I became the person in the right seat working with the new people in the airplane, and now I'm out on the runway with screeching tires and directional control. But it was terrific, and I really enjoyed that role and liked working with people. It was minimal training. I didn't have them for very long, and I tried to cram as much as they could tolerate into every training session because they were going to be turned loose to the wolves very quickly. So sometimes it was a little bit on the tough love side. And one technique I had when they were just about ready, I needed to prepare them for flying in the clouds if some of the instruments weren't working properly. They call it partial panel. So they have to revert to some standby instruments that takes a little interpretation. Well, instructors will do that by taking a round rubber cover and just pasting it over the flight instrument that they want to simulate failed. But it's not terribly accurate because when it actually happens, the instrument is actually showing an erroneous indication, so you kind of have to disregard it and pay attention to the other instruments. So my way around that was wait till the airplane was descending into an undercast, the clouds underneath us. And whenever I was flying with the trainee, they did all the flying. So I was just sitting in the right seat twiddling my thumbs. So what I would do as we approached the cloud deck when we were about to go into instrument conditions would be pour a nice hot cup of coffee out of the thermos and set the coffee cup on the throttle, open coffee cup on the throttle quadrant, and turn to the other pilot and say, you know, I probably ought to fly a little bit here just to keep my hand in. Do you mind if and oh, go right ahead, Waldo. Well, great. So just before we went in the cloud deck, I'd pull the twin Beech up into a barrel roll, which is a positive G maneuver, so the coffee stays where it belongs. It doesn't upset. And just about that time, so it was the startle factor for the other pilot, and just about the time we rolled level, we'd go foof into the clouds. The gyro instruments were tumbled, and I would say, okay, this is a partial panel exercise, your controls.
That's a great story. That is a great story.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to start flying cargo in the Twin Beeches, but I really enjoyed that role. And anyone who did that, well, has several reasons why, but I stayed with it. And I always loved DC-3s, so it was a pretty easy progression to go from the Beech 18 to the DC-3. Airplane everybody loves, a very iconic machine, and I got to fly it quite a bit. In fact, I ended up not only flying cargo in it, but doing aerial applications, spraying with it on doing forestry work and things like that. So really got to know the airplane pretty well. After DC-3s, I continued with cargo, ended up flying larger jets, things like that, for a rather colorful company that anyone in the freight business would instantly recognize the name, and it had a reputation for not flying the best maintained airplanes, shall we say. Always said we flew these DC-8s around the world with a roll of duct tape and a magic pencil. And the boss was a little gruff, shall we say. And if he had some pilots that came from a background of flying the same equipment in the airline industry, which was better maintained and they didn't have too much excitement and things like that, they would have maybe an engine fire indication, which is usually caused by a bleed air leak, so the engine isn't actually on fire. So before you get rash and secure the engine and blow the bottle, you simply reduce the throttle first and give that a chance for the fire warning to go out. Well, the airline pilots would get these things on these old heaps that we were flying and instantly react, you know, memory item training. And they'd shut the engine down and blow the bottle, and which there wasn't really any damage to the airplane, but they had to replace the fire bottle after they got there. It was down for maintenance for a while. And the boss would get aggravated and fire them. So we were flying in support of Desert Storm in 1990, and quite regularly flying downrange in the Middle East and then coming back again. So it was the wee hours of the morning, we're coming back empty. We're over the Eastern Mediterranean. And there's 3 people in the cockpit, pilot, co-pilot, and a flight engineer. And everything's cool, calm, and collected. We're at cruise altitude, which is not usually where a fire warning happens. And we get a fire warning on the number 1 engine. So the first thing we do, all 3 of us craned our necks and looked back towards the number 1 engine on the left-hand side, which is almost always a pointless exercise because even if there's an engine fire, it's contained within the nacelle and you can't see it unless you're behind the engine. But in this particular case, it was lit up, had burned through the nacelle, and was burning like crazy. So the flight engineer reached up for the fire shutoff handle, and I grabbed his wrist and said, hold on just a second. It's on a titanium strut, so even if it burns up and falls off, it won't kill us. But do you happen to have the video camera you're not supposed to have in your bag? And he said, yeah. I said, let me borrow that. So I grabbed the video camera, filmed the engine burning, came back in, to the cockpit, focused on the altimeter, which happened to be flight level 350 or 35,000 feet, because the boss, while he was firing people, would say, "Nothing burns at 35,000 feet." Concluded the video, we put that away, went through the shutdown emergency procedure, caged the engine, continued on to Rota, Spain, which was an interim stop, parked the airplane, rode up the engine fire and fire bottle discharge, and off we go. But normally in any structured environment, this would involve long safety reports and issues and a lot of paperwork. It was late at night, we're tired, and I knew the only real issue was not being fired by the boss. So I queued the videotape up to where that whole sequence began, put it in a company material or a COMAT envelope, and on the outside, address label on the outside, the boss's name was Connie. I said, "To Connie, love Waldo," and left nothing else. And sent that away. I never filled out another report. Everything was fine.
That's a great one. That's a really good one.
It's a little like marriage. You can get used to anything after a while. And no, you get used to it. It becomes pretty routine. It isn't like flying in the States. So sometimes a little diplomacy is involved. I've had long conversations over tea in Kabul in an Afghani air traffic control center to kind of smooth things over. And this is a later conflict. And because some of the people that work for this freight company with a reputation that I was flying for could be a little raucous, I have the distinction of getting crew members out of jail on 5 continents. So that probably wasn't maybe airplane related, but that might address some interesting stories. The Beech 18 was just a terrific design to start with. In the beginning, it was innovative, performed very, very well. And 2 things, it was a very well designed airplane, and it was a very well built airplane, or I should say is, they're still out there, and frankly built hell for stout, which by the time the airplane drifted down, because they were the Learjet of their day when they were originally conceived, and the military used them for a variety of purposes during World War II. So by the time Twin Beeches, the airplane type, filtered down to all the non-Sched freight carriers, they were pretty well worn. And the reason they were still around was because they were so robust. Also relatively simple and easy. Any mechanic could fix the airplane. So it starts with a very good airframe and a very good design that can stand up to the abuse and the neglect that a lot of freight carriers gave them. And then you add that to its usually was very early in a pilot's career, and those are very, when you fly an airplane, that's very influential when early in your career. And sometimes it kind of devolved into a survival situation. So you had an association with this airplane that you kind of trusted with your life, or it got you through in spite of your own lack of knowledge, perhaps. So that's why people tend to be very dedicated, or certainly remember their time while they were flying Beech 18s.
Well, that's what I'm hearing from a lot of guys, that there's this kind of bond that sort of develops. I think that's kind of what you're speaking to, this
Right.
kind of a bond that you sort of establish.
It's a little off the freight business, but you have to remember the first book that Charles Lindbergh wrote was called We. And what he was, and that was about his flight to Paris and all that other stuff. And what that title referred to, when Lindbergh referred to we, it was plural, referring to the pilot and the airplane he flew. So that has that kind of factors into it. And as long as we're on the subject, we also includes, and every freight pilot will tell you this, we got to do the fun part, flying the airplane. But we never would have moved a wheel had it not been for innumerable mechanics, freight loaders, technicians, dispatchers, all those things. It takes a lot of people to keep an airplane in the air, and the pilot, frankly, has the simplest job. I found that it's nice to have the technical background, but in the end, it's kind of what you bring to the table, personality-wise, that at the time, because of the nature of the business, and it was a little wild and woolly, and the FAA kind of tried not to pay too much attention to that. You had to have a little character or initiative or gumption just to do the job. So it attracted those people, I think. Certainly, and that's another reason, addressing the cachet of the Beech 18, being able to fly that airplane, which is not going to make something out of it, it isn't, but it's a much more demanding airplane than, say, that Boeing 747 that's sitting back there, which I've also flown. And so having flown the Beech 18 makes you a better pilot all the way through your career. And of course, that's the opinion of all Beech 18 pilots. Other people may differ, but that's kind of the nature of it. Well, the Beech, skydiving is a lot of fun. Pilots tend to look at skydivers out of their corner of their eye because they figure they're all crazy. And as it turns out, that's true. But I went out to I was already a professional pilot. In fact, I was flying Twin Beeches. But I also flew aerobatic airplanes and wore a parachute in case of a structural failure of the airplane, that kind of thing. And I thought perhaps it was best that I learn how to use one. So I went out to take a first jump course with no intention of pursuing the sport. And that was a lot of years and 4,000 jumps ago. So it's so much fun. It's enticing to do that. And at the time, most drop zones by far had single engine Cessnas. If it was a really impressive drop zone, we're talking about in the 70s here, it had a Beech 18, usually a very old D model. So the progression of the airplanes, maybe that D model started out as a corporate airplane in the 50s, and it was meticulously maintained and beautiful. And then it ended up with the freighters, where it suffered a little neglect, had a cargo door cut and had a crew door, other cargo modifications. Looked somewhat the worse for wear. So the next step was to the Skydivers. Now, following the Skydivers, it went to the junkyard and got turned into beer cans. So that was the quality of the airplanes that the Skydivers were flying. But it took a bunch of us in the air, more than we were usually used to jumping. It flew higher because the engines are supercharged. And so we had longer free falls and a lot of fun. And so it was very nice if you had a Twin Beech drop zone back then, that kind of thing. Pretty interesting. I've hauled all kinds of things, all kinds of munitions, Stinger missiles, Mark 48 torpedoes, Sidewinder missiles, iron bombs, tons of ammunition, loads of toilet paper, olive drab, and a menagerie of animals. I've flown racehorses in Boeing 727s. In the DC-8, we hauled cattle. We hauled horses in that as well. I ended up flying a load of water buffalo from Africa back to a zoo in the United States in the DC-8. Whales, live whales, things like that. And dolphins and etc., marine mammals. And interestingly enough, we had one DC-8 that had been a corporate airplane, had belonged to an arms dealer that ran up on some hard times. And this airplane was a real corporate barge. It was everything with luxury interiors, gold-plated, actual gold-plated fittings in the washrooms and things like that. But then it was acquired by this bandit freight company. All that was stripped out. A cargo floor was reinforced, a cargo door was cut in the airplane. And the very first load we flew in the airplane was 215 head of hogs from Shanghai to Miami. So there's a contrast. They were a particular breed. They were being brought to the United States for breeding, that kind of thing. Well, the Beech 18 is a little more manual, a little more hands-on airplane. And it's not difficult to fly. But it does, on the ground particularly, for the ground handling, it requires your attention. It's not particularly treacherous. But on the landing roll, if you're rolling out and you're paying attention, you stay ahead of all the little corrections you need and you keep it going in a straight line. But the airplane looks back over its shoulder with one eye at you once in a while. And if you're paying attention, it's never a problem. But if you're half asleep, it will bite you. Just like that. And you'll be suddenly looking back where you came from. When you lose control of the airplane on the ground, it's called a ground loop. And I've been fortunate enough never to have ground loop to Beech 18, but not all the people that can flown them can say that. So what you can also say is that wasn't a ground loop. It was a quick check for traffic behind me. So
you're saying the 747 is more automated?
Well, it's not.
Kind of flies itself almost.
It is the 747. It's actually not so much the automation, but it's just a very, very easy airplane to fly. It's a delight to fly. You would think it would be a truck, but it handles beautifully. And it's everything about the airplane is just easy.
Wow. Okay.
And comfortable. You know?
Cool.
And the Beech 18 just demands a little more of the pilot.
I love the idea of looking back at you.
Bite